Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Wherever you are in the world, welcome to Revolution.Aero. This week, the revolution is autonomous. We're going to be looking at autonomy in flight. We've got 5 or 6 great speakers who come on, people leading the autonomous revolution. But let's start someone who isn't, someone who's building a short takeoff and landing aircraft, formerly chief strategist on the Airbus Van Halen eVTOL program. He founded Vertical Fat Power before that in 2006. Marc Ausman is the CEO and founder of Airflow.aero. Marc, are you here?
Good morning.
How are you?
Good morning, Alasdair.
Great to see you. Marc, you are out there, you're building an aircraft. No one knows why anyone would choose to do that, but you want to.
Yeah. Right.
Today's session is all about autonomy and autonomous aircraft. Why are you not building one?
Well, our first aircraft will have a pilot on board, but we're actually building an autonomous aircraft. The big question is really how we get there. I think everybody wants to ultimately get to an autonomous aircraft where we can remove the pilots and we get the benefit of higher payload and crew scheduling and potentially some cost savings as well down the road. So we all want to get there. The question is, how do we get there? And so we're just taking a different approach than the other people on the panel. And our approach, if you want to use the automotive industry for comparison, let's compare the Waymo approach versus the Tesla approach. And the Waymo approach is where they go direct to autonomy. So there's, they're doing some testing with safety drivers and so on, but really the vehicle and their first product out there does not have a driver in the car. And right now they're doing early trials and limited trials in some cities. The other approach is the Tesla approach, where they actually put a driver in the car, and they started this 10 years ago. And today they have a booming business worth, I think it's about $400 billion right now. And they have the ability to build a business, build a brand, learn how to manufacture the cars, collect tons of data along the way, and use that data and use their experience in the field to mature their self-driving car. In 10 years, they'll both have fully autonomous systems, and no one will really care how they got there. But for the sake of development, they took 2 very different approaches to get there. And so we're taking the Tesla route, which is where we want to put an aircraft in the field with a pilot, and we can build a business, build a brand, learn manufacturing, get product into the field. And build a sustainable business, and then collect a lot of data along the way, so that we're really in a leadership position based on lots of actual real-world field experience to be able to move to an autonomous platform when the regulations support that.
And so that's an interesting path. And do you think eventually you'll end up doing it yourself, or will you outsource the autonomy to another company?
Well, the interesting thing about autonomy is I think that everyone will have equal access to that airspace and to the regulations that allow that. So I don't think any company will have a distinct advantage. There's certainly companies brewing it in-house, but there's lots of companies building the technology that others can use. And so I expect that while we're building our company with a piloted aircraft, there'll be other companies that are building up the autonomy technology and using it initially as a safety enhancement feature on aircraft. And then when the regulations allow it, again, it's not gated by technology, it's gated by the regulations. And when the regulations allow it, we'll add that technology to our aircraft. I know that sounds simpler, it's obviously more work than that, but in general, that's the approach we want to take. So we'll most likely use somebody else's autonomy technology and combine that with the regulations and how they're evolving.
So you're focusing on same-day e-commerce deliveries, and
correct.
So having a pilot is just wait. You're not even getting it. It's not adding anything to the economics. Still work for you with a pilot, even if it's a retired jockey.
They do. The economics work just fine, and the economics of a short takeoff and landing aircraft are significantly better than those of a helicopter or a VTOL, and because of that, pilot, no pilot, we'll still be competing against other aircraft with pilots, or in our case, the economics work out, I think, favorably for us, whether there's a pilot or not a pilot. Again, we'll all be able to move to pilotless aircraft or remotely piloted aircraft or autonomous aircraft, whatever you want to call them, around the same time. And when I say that, certainly there's companies doing trials now, but really to deploy this autonomous technology broadly in urban areas, that's the time frame for that is still very uncertain, and we believe quite a ways out. So in the interim, we're going to build a business with a piloted aircraft, and all the modeling and everything we've done so far shows that it still works out. Remember, when you have an autonomous, and actually I prefer to call it remotely piloted aircraft, because it's going to be a long time before they're truly autonomous. So we prefer to use the word remotely piloted. You still have to pay a pilot even though they're sitting remotely. And initially the regulations will be a one-to-one relationship between the aircraft and the pilot. So you still have one pilot per aircraft. In addition, you have more expensive systems on the aircraft to support the remotely piloted operations, because all the systems today are designed to fail, and the pilot is a backup for those failure modes. When that pilot goes away, you need much more redundant systems, and the EASA has already outlined some very very strict guidelines, very hard to meet regulations around eVTOL aircraft. Not specifically autonomy, but that's implied in that as well. That just makes those systems very, very complex and expensive. So I would argue that the early economics, if you don't have a pilot on board, aren't immediately obviously better. They're probably even worse.
Okay, we've got a question from the audience from Caden Stasioni. I'm going
to. Hi there. Can you all hear me?
Okay. Yes, we can. Yeah. Great.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I appreciate being here in such a eclectic group of individuals. Thanks so much. I think it is a wonderful opportunity to share some information. Marc, I really enjoyed listening to you and kind of following what you're doing. So I am the co-founder, and I just recently left as CEO of Jaunt Air Mobility. We're an Uber Air taxi partner.
Yep.
And prior to my forming of Jaunt, thinking of building an eVTOL aircraft, I have always been focused on the logistics supportability space and on the infrastructure. Just a little background, I'm a former commercial pilot, and I've designed several aircraft for military applications. But what I found was, and the reason I'm moving into other ventures is I formed another company years ago in the logistics space, and with COVID being a worldwide problem, we have quadrupled our logistics supportability business throughout North America since January of this year. And one of the things that when you talk about building aircraft for all of us, and I think this also applies to, AI, and I'm very interested to hear Luuk speak a little later, but one of the things that we focused on is where are you going to get the business? Now, so for example, we have over 200 terminals in North America, 50 terminals in Africa that are intermodal, multi-domain terminals that do the switch out between the rail, land, sea, air. And what we see is with these electric aircraft is, they're not going to have the range and payload capability of the, existing ICE powered aircraft. So, one of the things that we do understand is where the business is, where the business is from the terminal space to how to break bulk of the package, whether it's package delivery. And we've had many talks with Amazon. People in the press think, I'm going to have a package come flying over in my neighborhood and drop down over the trees. No, even Amazon's looking at piloted aircraft while they're provisioning for full autonomy operations. And that's where you're going to get a lot of the certification hours in flying these aircraft, these innovative new aircraft, whether they're in the U.S. Part 23 or Jaunt was going under standard, Part 29 certification. But I think part and parcel with the financial model is it's just not a technology solution. It's just not an aircraft solution. But you have to look at the ROI, and you have to understand what kind of payload are we moving, and what's the cost of that payload? What's the per pound per mile capability of a revenue model, and how many sorties in a day can you deliver, and what's the economics? So, for example, in our company, we've evaluated that we have about 400 million pounds of freight monthly that could go to an eVTOL or some type of electrified VTOL aircraft. But we also have a fair amount of freight that would go to a fixed wing cargo, like what Pipistrel has been working on in that 350 mile to 500 nautical mile radius of action. So, I think that when you look at the aircraft design and you look at the technology, I think it's also important to understand, the mission requirements, the ROI, the cost of delivering a package, and, geographically, where are you going to start off? So, from our perspective, the risk reduction is over the waterways. So they're port cities, and being able to fly over the waterways to reduce the risk of flying over populated areas. So these are some of the things that I think affect every aircraft design. And that's why I think that when you talk about what you are doing, it really rings true. And I think that it's going to be a matter of the company that can put a solid mission plan together and be able to source the business that pays the revenues, so that paying the bills is going to be very, very important. And that's one of the reasons why I was very excited to be part of this autonomous revolution, because the cost on per pound per mile to do it autonomously is the way to go. We're not going to get there immediately out of the gate, though I think it can be well proven to do a transitional model. Because if you look at the technology, and again, Luuk would, I think, bring a lot to this as well as some of the other players here, particularly with Wisk. When you're talking about a piloted system and you're looking at, triplex redundancy and lockstep programming and all of that good stuff, we can't have a neural network system. We have to have a deterministic system in autonomy that's going to be able to fly these aircraft safely and effectively and have it approved by EASA or FAA.
Yeah, and again, autonomy is maybe not the best word. Remotely piloted, is kind of, I think, more practical term, and it implies the aircraft carries out a set of instructions that you've given it, which is, fancy autopilot, basically. So there's a lot to unpack there. Let me just talk real briefly and
thanks, Caden, and we'll get Caden on. We'll get you on the next one as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Marc.
Do I have a second to just kind of unpack those? So we do think about the end state quite a bit of sort of what this autonomous vision looks like of drones and larger aircraft flying around without pilots. But really, it's important to think about the stepping stones that we need to do to get there. That's not going to happen instantaneously. There's all these stepping stones that need to happen, and there's all these progressions to get there. So, for example, the pilots that we have today are a stepping stone to build a business, to a remotely piloted aircraft, and ultimately an autonomous aircraft. For a startup, we think that's the right path. Other companies maybe have a different set of constraints and want to approach it differently than we do. But for us, that's the approach that makes sense. Right now, for our mission, the batteries don't make sense. So a hybrid solution is a stepping stone to getting to fully battery electric, just like the Prius was a stepping stone to getting to fully electric cars, which now 20 years later are finally starting to maybe hit that inflection point. Also we, after leaving the Airbus program, we actually put together a hypothesis of what we wanted to build and why, and talked to a lot of potential customers first. So it was really important to us to not build a science project or a technology, but rather to build a solution to a problem that exists today. So, our requirements, the payload, the hybrid, the range of the aircraft, which effectively drove the hybrid, the turnaround times, all that stuff was informed by talking with potential customers in doing that. So before we actually did any engineering, the first thing we did was talk to a whole bunch of companies that we thought would be potential customers to really understand, the problem space. And that really informed our decision and actually drove numerous changes from what we originally thought was what we needed. So we did take kind of a market first approach rather than a technology first approach. And for our particular set of constraints, we thought that putting a pilot in a hybrid electric aircraft and doing a STOL versus a VTOL was the right thing to do.
Brilliant, Marc. Thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
All
right. Great. Thanks, Marc. Stay safe. Right, Luuk, you've been name checked already, so it'd be great if we can now have. We're now delighted to have Luuk van Dijk from Daedalean or Daedalean. Pronounce it how you like. Luuk,
I say Daedalean, but yes, pleased to be here. You catch me by surprise. I thought it was fifth.
I know, but you've been name checked, so I thought we'd come straight to you.
Okay.
You've been listening to the questions, and do you want to just quickly, for those who don't know it, and I'm sure everyone does, can you just explain quickly what Daedalean is?
Yes, we started about 4 years ago when I noticed a number of eVTOL projects popping up in the world, and I thought, while everybody's busy building their aircraft with new energy storage and new propulsion and new structures and new modes of operation, the last thing they have time and the skill set and the appetite for risk for is to develop the autonomy that they're all going to need by the time they get certified and start flying. So I figured, it's going to be 5 years before the first ones will be certified to fly and they'll start piloted. So it would be great by that time if I had the instruments to first massively reduce the complexity of operation, simplify the operation, and then go to the kind of full autonomy that you need, because I figured that's a completely different skill set to develop than to convince Mother Nature to defy gravity or to convince the FAA that your thing is safe. So what we've developed is a set of functions that. So then what we did, we looked at what the human pilot actually does in the system of civil aviation today, and it's quite a central role. So aircraft today are pretty manual affairs, and the avionics are deliberately not very integrated. They all go through a set of eyes and a human visual cortex to make the final call. So we figured we can make more instruments that will require the pilot for oversight, or we can start at the other side and see what it is that the unique human capability is and start developing that. And then you get into the new type of systems that are called AI. I have a note on that word. So we look at machine learned systems, and then everybody knows these are black boxes, and you can never get that certified because nobody knows how they work. So I figured while everybody thinks that, we can start working on, understanding how they work, and not only build the systems that are good enough to make the kind of judgment calls that the human makes today, but also build the tools and the instruments and the mode of thinking for a regulator like EASA and the FAA to see that these things are fit for purpose and safe. And it was delightful to see a lot of misunderstanding and preconceptions about how impossible this was. So by now we've published a report with EASA on some sort of theoretical foundations, and we're working on a follow-up on that, and there are some other things in the pipeline. So our goal is to develop the kind of machine equivalent of human capability, which you'd call AI, so that we can get to this ultimate form of autonomy, which does not require remote piloting. So
that was going to be my next question, because I really want to talk to you about certification. But so what's the relationship between autonomy and AI?
So I think that if you look at if you would redesign the worldwide system of civilization from the ground up, you could get a long way with properly system engineering and doing automation. But given how deep the human functions are in the whole process and how hard it is to uproot that whole system of rules and regulations. For example, in VFR, you need eyes to deconflict and not fly into other people that fly. So to meet that requirement, you're going to have to give the computer eyes. And so these kind of problems are what's termed AI. So the problem with the term AI is that it has, since the 1950s of the previous century, or maybe even longer, it has meant the sort of thing we can barely do, or we can almost do. So it's the scary stuff that, and in the 1950s that was playing chess, and then 15 years ago it was playing Go, and since about 5 years or so we can recognize cats in YouTube videos. So you have to not underestimate how difficult that problem is. So you cannot write a computer program with a team of 30 software engineers that takes an image and decides if there's a cat in there. So to solve that kind of problem, you need these modern techniques that have only fairly recently become possible with the advent of massive computation power and big data. And so we prefer to talk about machine learned systems. So you need machine learned systems to solve these kind of problems. And then what you shouldn't think of is that there's a magic black box that you tell, oh, I would like to fly from Half Moon Bay to the Pinnacles today. You take well-defined subtasks of the art of flying, and then you can build a system that meets the VFR requirements of seeing other aircraft on visual, even the ones that don't show up on a radar, or ones that can recognize a runway on visual. And make the call to abort or not because there's the burning wreck of the previous guy that tried to land there. So these are clearly, there's no equivalent system today, and you have to solve these problems. And so I wanted to tag into what Marc just said about remote piloting. I'm not convinced that that's an easier way out, because so this problem of deconflicting, if you do this from the ground, then it means if you lose the command and control, you're flying blind. So to deal with that, you're going to need some form of autonomy. And then if you make that good enough, you can complete the mission as planned, then why do you need the remote pilot at all? So either your loss of command and control is a land as soon as possible event, for which you need something that finds the least worst place to land, for which we have a system, by the way. And then if you do solve it, you might as well, I personally, as a human passenger, I would be hesitant to get in an aircraft where the person in control, is with somebody on the ground with a joystick who does not have skin in the game has control of my aircraft. I would much rather have
get his bonus if
Say it again?
He won't get a bonus if it crashes.
Nah, that's the least. Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
I forgot.
you did.
Okay.
But the way you put it is very clear and very easy to understand. The way regulators are putting it is that you need to prove safety for non-deterministic systems.
Very good point. So the regulator has been, given the task to make sure on behalf of the public that these things are safe, and they should. I want to emphasize that. So there has been some talk about, we don't know how these systems work. Let's get a pass. Let's sign a form that I know it's not deterministic, but I think it's safe anyway. I think that's a massive mistake. The first accident that happens will have a massive repercussions for everyone. So you have to prove that it's safer than the human. And then the word non-deterministic, that's also very interesting. I think it's a misconception. So the thing is, if you have an automatic system dealing with a real world situation, there is uncertainty in the environment. So there's Sebastian Thrun wrote it very nice in his book about probabilistic robotics. You have to deal with uncertainty. So currently, the way uncertainty is dealt with in avionics is by entirely, outlawing it and passing it to the human. So anything that wasn't on the checklist goes to the human, who then goes through a checklist. So if you want to, you have to deal with this. So we have no choice. If we want autonomy, we need systems that can deal with this uncertainty in the environment. And that non-determinism is often attributed to the system, but it's really a problem in the environment that you have to deal with anyway. And then the sort of systems we develop, a system that takes a camera image and says, there's a runway there, or there's an aircraft there, or this looks like terrain I shouldn't fly into, that can be completely deterministic. Given the same image, pixel for pixel, it would produce bit for bit the same output. So the trick is then the worrying about the non-determinism is a bit of a red herring, because the system itself is perfectly reproducible and analyzable. What you have to do is you have to show that the data that you trained and tested on in the lab is sufficiently representative of the randomness you're going to find out in the real world. So that was actually one of the major conclusions from our report with EASA. So it's not trivial or easy. It definitely helps if you know what you're doing, but it's not impossible to, for a well-defined function, restrict yourself to a class of functions, a class of systems that you can analyze, and then put up criteria for when you would accept this as safe. And then there's actually an interesting side effect. If you are familiar with the art of DO178C, then you know the way that it works. It's the standard for how to certify software for aerospace purposes. And then, so what happens is you have some function in the aircraft that's done by a computer, and then you go through your system engineering and your safety analysis and say, okay, this thing should not fail more than once in 10 to the 7 hours. And then you go to the table and say, okay, that's design assurance level B. And then there's this amount of extra work that you have to do with your human team of programmers to make sure that your requirements were good and they were attainable and they are actually met by the system. But nothing in that process actually guarantees that your system will then fail not more than once in 10 to the 7 hours of flight. And what you have to realize is that's already an exception compared to all the other systems in your aircraft. So any strut or structural bit of thing or engine part is put on a test bench in the lab. You beat on it 50,000 times to establish that the mean time between failure is beating on it 47,500 times, and then that number goes into your safety analysis. And now the interesting thing is that with these machine learning systems, you can get the same type of guarantee. So yes, they are not perfect. But they are analyzable and the risk is manageable if you do it right. And that is actually a bonus on top of, I would call it hand-engineered, so hand-learned systems where you have a team of primates that are hopefully well paid, typing random lines of code until they satisfy a V diagram. So the paradox seems to be, I think, and this is actually kind of surprising, that by going for this harder class of systems, we can actually get to a higher level of safety, provided we do it right. And then the other thing I think is important is that we and the public should not be satisfied until we've actually proven that. So that's actually a very important point. We should not have the attitude that the old regulator should step aside and let modern age take over, and because that's the wrong attitude.
That's brilliant. Very, very quickly, almost a yes/no answer because we're running out of time. Are there major differences between the EASA and FAA views on AI and autonomy?
So I can't say too much about the FAA, but there will be announcements in the future. But so far, we have actually found a very receptive ear inside the FAA as well as in EASA. And I think the difference of approach is mainly along there's these stereotypical lines about, the difference between Airbus and Boeing, the difference between European pilots and American pilots. And I see some of that. So the EASA started with a fairly theoretical approach under the mandate of the European Union said, do something about reliability of AI in aerospace. And they started with the theory and they're sort of climbing down to the practice. And then in what you see in the FAA is more experimental approach, inspired by these NASA grand challenges. Let's fly first and see how it works, and then we'll build up the theory later. And that's actually great because, they can meet in the middle and have hopefully a coherent view. And but other than that, I think both sides of the ocean are totally willing to see that, this is a set of problems you have to solve. We can, if we cannot get a pass or weasel ourselves around it. And then I figured, I might as well solve that and become a valuable company.
Brilliant. Luuk, thank you so much for coming on. That was brilliant. Thanks so much. We're now delighted to have Gary Gysin from Wisk. Gary's got more than 30 years in this market. Gary, can you hear us?
I can.
Brilliant. Gary, can you take us back and remind us about what Wisk has been doing with autonomous aircraft?
Yeah, so we're going straight to self-flying and, starting down the autonomy path. And this journey started back in 2010. Larry Page of Google fame started this initiative off. And we went through subscale prototypes, of course, and then full-scale prototypes. And right now we're on our 5th iteration of the aircraft. And all of it has been autonomous. All of it has been self-flying. And we think, a couple of the panelists have mentioned that that's the prize, and we totally believe that is the prize. But a huge part of that, and the reason for that is, it's a safety case. It's actually much safer to have a self-flying aircraft than it is to have a piloted aircraft. You've got over 80% of aviation accidents are human error. And it doesn't mean that people aren't skilled at what they're doing, but the systems are incredibly complex. And so, we decided to go down that path and call it the SpaceX path, to do things a little bit differently and to innovate in this particular area. So we've been charging down this path. We're over 1,400 test flights on our full-scale vehicles without an incident, knock on wood. And so for us, safety is, a huge factor. Operating costs are a huge factor. How serviceable the ultimate aircraft is a huge factor. And so, we've decided that we're going straight for that because we think, like Luuk's company, who is solving a problem that, we encourage Luuk and many other companies in that space, go solve those problems. These problems are solvable, and autonomy is happening. It's happening more in the defense side, but aircraft are flying every day and millions of miles of flight, and they're all autonomous. Now, they've got more expensive sensors, the bigger aircraft, and this, that, and the other thing, but they're flying beyond visual line of sight. So this isn't a technical problem. It's more of a confidence and a safety case, and obviously getting the regulator to support this.
What's the biggest thing you've learned in the last 10 years?
Oh boy, well, first of all, self-flying. How do you fly an aircraft in a system? And I would call it a system. So the technology to do the aircraft, the technology to do the software is pretty straightforward. It's the rest of the pieces that have to come together to form a system. And so you have detect and avoid. You have airspace integration. You have the open infrastructure that pulls all this together. You have the whole multimodal piece of it. But, learnings in battery technology and advances there, learnings in avionics, obviously in aircraft design, things of this nature. So we've, because we've been focused squarely on the self-flying aspect of this, we've learned a ton in terms of what it takes to do that, but more importantly, what the system is that is required to support this. And then also driving through what's the con-op that we're going to need and what kind of companies need to play in this system. And so, we believe we're going to lead this market. We believe we're going to be the first self-flying aircraft that is flying in urban cities. And it's okay for us that other people are going a piloted route. That's fine. But, we're deciding to go for the bigger prize, if you will.
Great. We've got lots of questions coming up, which I'm going to start throwing to you.
Okay.
Simon Pippard, Council Bird and Bird. When do you see regulators breaking the one-to-one link between crews and aircraft? Will regulators permit a team of pilots to manage a fleet with a gradually reducing number of pilots until almost everything is automated?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't see the same problem that the first speaker saw in terms of it has to be one-to-one. That's not what we're seeing at all. We're heavily engaged right now in 2 different geographies. We've got an operation in New Zealand, and we're working with the regulator down there, the CAA, New Zealand CAA. But we're also heavily engaged with the FAA and their whole autonomy group. And no one is thinking about one-to-one. All of the discussions are one-to-many. And so, time frame on this, that's the open question. And so I think anybody that would predict exactly when all this is going to come together and there's going to be a published cert basis and regulatory approval for all of it, they're just crystal balling. And so, I'd hate to say that. It's going to take years for sure. But we're working, we're heavily engaged, we're taking their feedback, we're adjusting, we're doing the things that we need to do, and then also engaging the rest of the ecosystem that, as I mentioned, this is a system. This is not just in aircraft and the software and hardware that we build on that aircraft. This will be a system.
Okay, my next question was asking you dates. Question from Charles Alcock, senior editor at AIN. Have any of the aircraft developers done any market research as to whether passengers will fly in autonomous aircraft?
Yeah, we've actually done quite a bit. And so one of the advantages of doing this New Zealand operation is we've been heavily engaged from the top levels of government down to the local tribes and citizens. We've been doing focus groups. We've been doing VR simulations. We've been taking feedback. We've been doing primary research also in the U.S. with customers in our launch cities. And so the answer is yes. But I think as Charles knows, you'll have people that are more trusting, more risk-taking to start, of course. Not everybody jumped in a Tesla and turned on autopilot and just started going. It took a bit. People probably drive the car around for a while and then try autopilot for a little bit until they get comfortable with it. So we're certainly going to see that kind of evolution in the market. But absolutely, we've got a strong segment of the market, especially people that have the commute problem, that don't want to spend an hour and a half in their car, that want to get on a 10-minute flight. It's important to them, whether it's business purposes, commute purposes, getting to see their family quicker, whatever the scenario is. There certainly is a class of people that very eagerly anticipate this whole market developing so that they can be customers of the service.
We've also been polling on 1,000 people a month for ages, and we're finding stays at about 16% at the moment. No one very and I agree. I think you're right. It depends on how risk taking is a big thing. Another question from Roger Sloman, managing director at Advanced Blast and Ballistic Systems. Everyone says that safety is the most important issue to deal with, yet the current position of the eVTOL projects and the FAA EASA do not reflect that position. And there's several examples. 1 kilogram bird strike is being proposed when the most frequent strike is with gulls at 2K and geese at 5 to 6. Emergency descent rate on land is 9.1 meters per second, but only 1.5 meters per second on water. Why? It's a tough question.
I think this is an evolution. There's not going to be an answer today, in this particular market. And so, we, as I mentioned before, we're heavily engaged with the FAA. We're going through all the processes. We're addressing some of the concerns. I think we're leading on thinking about the CONOP, thinking about these use cases, thinking about safety problems like bird strike and other sorts of things like that. But there's not going to be an answer today, of course. I mean, this is going to be an evolution. And, as I mentioned earlier, this is going to occur over the next several years. But we have to prove it. We have to prove that it's safe. We have to prove that it's safer than a piloted aircraft, which it will be. I'm fully confident in that. I do not think this is going to be a technical problem. This problem has already been solved. And we will be able to solve it, and other people in the industry will be able to solve it. It's really pulling the pieces together, pulling the system together, and then proving that safety case. So I wouldn't expect that thinking to be here today. We've got part of what we feel our mission is to show the path, show how the pieces fit together, prove it, and prove it to the regulator. We're not expecting them to come to us and say, hey, here's how it's got to be. Because they don't know yet. It hasn't all been pulled together into an autonomous system. So we believe that's part of our mission, is to provide that education and provide those proof points.
You're getting so many questions. I'm going to let you go in a second, Gary.
Okay.
Here's another controversial one from Karen Spencer at Flutter. Is the New Zealand test flight permission environment less safety rigorous than the US?
No, it's just a different cert basis. It's not less safe. And so, I think about adventure tourism kinds of flights and things like that. If you go on that kind of cert basis, which lots of people do, people fly in helicopters, they're, inherently less safe than other forms of transportation. And so, no, it's not that, we went to New Zealand because of that. There was, it's a very contained area where we're flying, down in the middle of nowhere. It's a very prescriptive route, and so it's the whole, prove it safe, and then escalate to the next level, if you will. And so, no, it's not so much that. CAA is widely recognized as a regulator. in the industry, and they've been, fantastic to work with, but they're not easy. Also, it's not like just show up and fly and throw a passenger in it and everything's good. It's difficult.
And it's COVID-free, which is nice. Question. Yeah. You've got a couple of questions on hydrogen fuel. Are you considering hybrid hydrogen fuel? What is the viability of a hydrogen power module as a long-range solution? Any thoughts on hydrogen quickly?
Yeah, so we're not going down the hydrogen path. We have looked at it. We're all electric. We'll stay all electric. There's like a cost issue there, and so in an operational aspect of that tends to get more expensive than going all electric. And so we're staying all electric. There'll be use cases for hydrogen, I'm sure, but that's not what we're going to do.
Brilliant. Gary, before the questions get even harder, thanks so much. Really appreciate you coming
on. Good. Thank you, Alasdair.
Thank you. We've got a really nice question about cargo on there. So if we can now get Dave from Elroy Air up. Dave, let's go quickly. What's the difference between Elroy Air and your competition?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. So we are an aerospace and logistics company. We're developing autonomous VTOL aircraft systems specifically for cargo to expand the reach of commercial logistics. Middle mile capacity for commercial shippers is what we're aiming to expand. We've been working on this problem for 4 years. We've flown a full-scale demonstrator in 2019. So we're in the small cohort of companies that have actually flown a full-scale system. And to your question, what's different? So I'd say first and foremost, payload and range, and then aside that, automated cargo handling. Like that's the headline. In terms of the first, payload and range, so there's a whole spectrum of delivery drones being developed. There's going to be use cases across the spectrum of payload and range. You've seen last mile drones, like Amazon and Wing out there doing trials. That's one piece of the landscape. And then at another end of the landscape, there are teams that are automating existing fixed wing aircraft, automating a Cessna Caravan. And so where we are is in a sweet spot in between these two, where, we looked at the spectrum and came to the conclusion that, single parcel delivery drones are going to be challenged on economics because there's just not a lot of value unless you're carrying blood or some other very high value parcel. There's not enough value to pay for the flight until it gets extremely optimized. And then at the higher end of the payload spectrum, there's just not enough benefit by taking a pilot out when you're still flying a Cessna Caravan. So what we decided was the right spot was 300 pounds of payload, and actually similar to what Marc mentioned earlier, that all electric range that you get, where 50, 100 miles on an all electric system is just not enough for our customers. So we've spent a long time talking to customers in big commercial logistics, in humanitarian aid, disaster relief logistics, and in military for resupply. And for these systems to be useful, they've got to be able to do a couple 100 miles of range. And so we're developing a transitioning VTOL aircraft specifically for cargo that does 300 pounds and a 300-mile range. And then extremely unique to our solution is that we're really designing it for automated cargo from the get-go. And you can see some videos of this on our website, some images we've posted. But alongside the program of developing the core aircraft, this aircraft has a modular cargo container, a cargo pod that it picks up and drops off. And we did that for several reasons. But high level, this is about warehouse integration, and it's about efficiency on the turnaround. And so the Chaparral, our aircraft, will pick up a cargo pod, fly it from A to B, deposit it at location B. And what that means is the aircraft doesn't sit around being loaded and unloaded, which is a really time-consuming part of air cargo today. It's safer because you don't have ground staffers walking right up to this VTOL aircraft. And it allows for unattended operations. It allows for longer, daily operations because you don't need, you just don't need as much human attention to the system, either for loading and unloading or for other parts of the operation.
So you brought up ground transportation, so you're getting a lot of questions about this. Why is autonomy different for drones than for vehicles like cargo trucks?
So there are fundamentally different operating environments. Vehicles on the ground operate in an environment that has a lot of structure. You've got road signs, you've got rules, but it's very dynamic because you have think about an automated delivery truck is going to come across unpublished construction zones, other drivers transitioning, so it's really, there's a lot more edge cases that need to be accounted for self-driving vehicles on the ground, autonomous vehicles on the ground. Not even mentioning that there's pedestrians all over the place. Aircraft, on the other hand, operate in an environment with a different kind of structure. There's different airspace rules, specific areas for takeoff and landing, published constraints like TFRs, with centralized control, air traffic control. I think that automating a vehicle that flies, there's a different kind of risk profile, but there's just fewer edge cases when you're up in the air, nothing's around. Like I look out my window right now out my office here, and I don't see a single aircraft. So there's this kind of, big open sky principle that I think makes automating aircraft in many ways an easier problem than ground vehicles.
Okay, question from Brian Garrett Glazer, managing editor, eVTOL.com. Are you saying the advantage of aerial autonomy is it will be deployed first because ground autonomy is harder? In a world where both are going to happen, which is definitely going to happen. So are you going to say that air autonomy will be deployed before ground autonomy?
I think that, and this may sound contrarian, but I think it will scale faster. There are already ground autonomy deployments. There are trials in very constrained areas, neighborhoods, like companies like Voyage are out there doing trials. But yeah, I think, true, like autonomous taxis will have very limited deployment, even say 3-4 years from now. I think we'll see more drones, autonomous aircraft doing unmanned deliveries than autonomous trucks in the next 5 years.
To be fair, I hadn't read Brian's first question, which was, considering the advances we're seeing in ground autonomous transport, can the speakers discuss what the actual market will look like for moving cargo by electric aircraft? Will it be as large as expected? And you've answered that one. Final question. Give your 3-year prediction, or your prediction for this market in 3 years' time, which other people will disagree with.
Well, I think I jumped the gun, and I just did that. Actually, I think in 3 years from now, we're going to start to see deployments of tens to not a lot of vehicles, but we're going to see real deployments starting, and we're going to see autonomous aerial cargo systems doing real work, doing real business, earning real revenues. And by the way, one note, I think the question asked about electric. I think we're going to get there on all electric systems, but we're starting with hybrid electric because today's battery technology is just not there yet to run missions of the length that our customers in big commercial logistics need. So, we're developing a hybrid electric system now, tracking battery technology very closely, tracking hydrogen fuel cell technology very closely, and we'll be able to update this aircraft, the core platform, as we go. But, we've got to start with where the technology is right now.
Brilliant. Dave, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks. And now let's go to, delighted to have Paul Smith, flight test pilot, Project Wayfinder, which is A-Cubed by Airbus's project. Paul, do you want to just explain Wayfinder to anyone who doesn't know it? Great background, by the way. You win on the background today.
Thanks, Alasdair. It's a great opportunity to join a distinguished panel here. So Wayfinder basically grew out of Vahana project, which was concentrated on looking at detect and avoid other aircraft, non-cooperative aircraft, and then also clearing a landing space to land. And so out of that came using technology, machine learning, and artificial intelligence to try to automate landing tasks and ground tasks for pilots in the cockpit using imagery.
Great. And you, and what are the biggest learnings? You joined it in January 2020 when you came from Google. What's the biggest challenge? What's the thing that surprised you the most since you joined?
I think the thing that surprised me the most is the rapid development that our engineers can do using imagery to solve very complex problems and analyzing video, providing spatial orientation, just using a visual system. It's very impressive, the speed that we can move.
And do you agree with the thoughts we've had from Luuk on dealing with regulators? What are you finding when you're talking to them? Because Airbus obviously already has extremely strong relationships with both the FAA and EASA, and every regulator in the world, probably.
Yeah, so our approach is really to focus on safety in the cockpit and pilot workload, which I think will translate to autonomous flight down the road. But right now we're looking at improving that capability and then moving to the opportunity of maybe having single pilot operations. And so our approach is much more methodical and regulatory scoped.
And do you think we're going to have pilots flying? Do you agree that we're going to start off with single pilot with a co-pilot on the ground on per aircraft, or do you think we're going to jump straight to single pilot, double pilot, single pilot, and then autonomy in the air?
Well, I come from a little different background than the panelists here. I've flown cargo operations, Boeing 767s and Boeing 757s internationally, and there are a lot of significant problems that we have to solve first. And I think we're on a path to do that. And the regulatory agencies are starting to come around and recognize some of the issues there. But there are still a lot of issues to be resolved. Smaller eVTOL aircraft are probably the right way to go. But when you start moving to large commercial aircraft with hundreds of passengers on board, it becomes a little bit more of an issue. And it's very easy to say that, and this is probably contrary to most of the panelists here, to say that systems can be safer than pilots. But the edge cases are where systems designed by engineers on the ground tend to fail. And those are the areas that we really have to concentrate on. The thought process and the judgment of a pilot is very difficult to capture and model perfectly. So I think we have a lot of challenges. I think we're on a path. And so again, Airbus's approach and Wayfinder's approach is to support the technological bricks that we are putting in place to get there in a very safe and safe way that meets the pace of the regulatory agencies.
We had an interesting comment earlier from Felix, who said pilots won't share the airspace with robots. As a former pilot, are you sympathetic?
We do it already, right? There are drones in the approach corridors at in London Heathrow and LAX. So yeah, we do that now, and there's a very concerted effort to provide more control over those kind of unmanned vehicles. Yeah, as a cargo pilot, I get the thing all the time that, well, we'll do it with cargo first because we don't have the same kind of risk, and I disagree because an autonomous 767 landing at LAX that's full of cargo has just as much threat to a 767 on the runway full of passengers. So I think there are issues we have to resolve, and like I said, we're on a path. I just would urge some caution and.
Great. We've got a question from Brian Garrett Glazer. What's the correct way to integrate both humans and AI into the safety loop for aviation? For example, we've seen issues on ground with humans as backup watchers because they get bored.
Well, that's a great thing. In fact, I flew the MQ-9 Reaper for quite a while, and that was a very challenging mission on the ground, just managing one aircraft, let alone several. I think I think the way to do it is a merging, if you will, of the pilot and the AI system. So as we integrate that technology in the cockpit, I think both can learn from each other. And what artificial intelligence can do, if you map enough signals and you get enough repetition, then you can use machine learning to start replicating decisions and judgments that pilots make. But to have an engineer on the ground kind of think all that through immediately is a bit risky. So to answer your question, I think a merging of the technologies and growing with each other as they merge is probably the right approach.
Great, and we're getting loads of questions, but I think maybe this will be the last one. This is from Cameron Spencer at Flutter. What is the biggest operating restriction for vision-based recognition systems?
I'll take two answers. One is the operational side is obviously for a visual EO/IR system, you need to have clear view of the ground or clear view of the system. And so in weather and occluded airspace, that's oftentimes a problem. The second one is really not so much of an issue with regulatory, because if we can meet the same precision location standards as a precision instruments landing system, then we actually have solved that problem. And so that certification regulation problem is not as difficult.
Okay, I said that was final one. We've got another great one from Andy Latcher, Aerospace and Autonomous Systems Research at Novelis. There is a big difference between certification of highly automated system that is used in emergency, e.g. auto GCAS, versus a highly automated system that is used routinely. What emergency backup systems would you suggest to accelerate transition?
Well, in today's current instrument landing systems, we have multiple sensors, multiple failure states, and multiple paths that we can go down and still result in the same safety. So the real basic answer is more redundancy and higher reliability, and those are all accomplished through testing and certification.
Great, Paul. I'm glad I'm asking the questions and not answering them. Thank you very much. Really great having you on. Thank you. Thanks so much to all our speakers. If you'd like to stay and network, please hang on. I'd like to thank our sponsors, BAE Systems, for this one. Please join us in a few weeks for the next one, and please stay on if you'd like to network.
Every idea, every solution, every platform starts with a spark. One that brings technology to life, transforming the imaginary into reality, the ordinary into the revolutionary. With a single spark, an intricate new network is born, crafted with purpose, powered by determination, infused with unmatched intellect. At BAE Systems, this is who we are. We breathed life into the world's most complex platforms, allowing them to detect threats, drive humankind forward, and discover the extraordinary marvels that will shape our future. Alongside thousands of dreamers who share our passion, we create connections that give today's systems tomorrow's capabilities. To protect what matters and create solutions where it counts. It all starts with a spark, an idea, a belief, a commitment to partnership, a commitment to excellence.